It begins the way all stories about queens should not with triumph, not with coronation, but with silence, locked doors, and the cold scrape of an executioner's blade being sharpened before dawn. Two queens, two wives of the same man, two deaths by command of the same king. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, names that still echo through stone corridors and tower walls. Names remembered for how they ended, more than how they lived. One died with dignity, surrounded by velvet, her enemies forced to watch her standing. The other died weeping, buried under straw, erased by quicklime, as if history itself were ashamed of her. But they were both queens, both daughters of England in the court of Henry VIII, and yet their executions could not have been more different, more revealing of the dark machinery behind the Tudor throne. To compare the deaths of Anne and Catherine is to expose more than just cruelty. It is to see power naked, wielded without justice, mercy, or memory. This is not just a tale of two heads that rolled. It is the anatomy of tyranny, wrapped in courtly ritual and sharpened steel. Anne Boleyn's fall from grace was not sudden, but it was choreographed with surgical precision. Once the crowned Queen of England, the woman for whom Henry VIII had defied the Pope and shattered centuries of Catholic tradition, she was slowly strangled by whispers, rumors, and political necessity. Her enemies, led by the cunning Thomas Cromwell, crafted a web of accusations, so outrageous it almost disguised its brutality: adultery, incest, treason, crimes that, even if false, required no forgiveness. Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace in the spring of the year 1536 and taken by barge down the Thames, not through Traitor's Gate like a common criminal, but up the Queen's Stairs, a final bitter courtesy that reminded her she still wore the crown, at least in name. She was housed in the royal apartments within the Tower, the same rooms she had stayed in during her coronation, a ghost of her own triumph, haunting her final days. Her trial was a formality, and though she was allowed to speak, no defense could rescue her. The men she was accused of sleeping with, including her own brother, had already been executed. Their silence was sealed in blood. Anne faced the scaffold dressed as a queen, her final speech calm, forgiving, and hauntingly gracious. A French swordsman was summoned from Calais not because Henry was kind, but because he wanted a clean death. Ce qui at end. One swing, no screams, no mess. Catherine Howard's death, by contrast, was the stuff of nightmares. Barely more than a girl when she married the king, Catherine had neither the cunning of Anne nor the protection of powerful allies. Her past full of neglect, abuse, and unsupervised interactions with men who should never have touched her was weaponized against her. Once whispers reached the ears of a jealous court, a new law was passed in the year 1541, making it treason for a queen not to disclose her sexual history to the king within the first 20 days of marriage. Catherine, who had no chance to understand the weight of that law, was arrested and stripped of her title immediately. No trial, no ceremony. She was manhandled from Hampton Court Palace, placed onto a barge like a prisoner, and taken through the city, beneath London Bridge, where the heads of her supposed lovers rotted above her. Unlike Anne, she entered the Tower through Traitor's Gate. She did not sleep in royal chambers. She was not dressed in velvet. She was placed in a cold cell and told she would die. Her only request the night before her execution was to practice laying her head on the block, so that when the moment came, she would not tremble. And yet she did. Her final words were barely audible, a whisper of remorse, of fear, too, of youth punished by politics and old men's lust. But the tragedy does not end with death. After Anne was beheaded, our ladies, fiercely loyal, gathered her body themselves. They would not let men touch her. They wrapped her in linen, placed her into an arrow chest, a pitiful substitute for a coffin. but still a gesture of honor. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her grave later marked, her memory never quite forgotten. Each year, white roses appear on her resting place. Catherine, however, received no such care. Her body, after being struck down by axe in front of a jeering crowd, was wrapped in a black cloak, dragged away, and dumped into a grave, prepared without love or grace. Quicklime was poured over her, not for hygiene, not for preservation, but to erase her, to destroy every trace. No monument was erected. The exact location of her grave remains uncertain, guessed at by historians, but never confirmed. Her name was to be dust. Her body was to vanish. 2 queens, 2 executions, one remembered, one forgotten. Anne Boleyn's death was political theatre, designed to destroy her while preserving the dignity of the throne. Catherine Howard's was a rushed punishment, ugly, cruel, and raw. Inflicted on a girl the court had never truly protected. One died under the eyes of history. The other disappeared beneath it. But both were devoured by the same man, Henry VIII, who loved only when it suited him, and discarded wives like spoiled meat when ambition or disappointment turned his heart to stone. And so the executioner raised his blade not just to cut through necks, but through legacy itself. To speak of Anne Boleyn is to speak of legacy, rebellion, and a daughter who would one day become the Virgin Queen. To speak of Catherine Howard is to whisper of abuse, manipulation, and a girl undone before she had ever truly lived. But if their deaths teach us anything, it is that being queen under a tyrant was never a protection. It was a target, and the scaffold waited, patient and merciless. There are weddings that shape nations, and then there are weddings that sign the death warrants of the brides. Anne Boleyn's marriage was the first of its kind, a union so scandalous it tore a kingdom from its spiritual anchor, set fire to papal authority, and elevated a mistress to a monarch through a coronation made not of roses, but of controversy and prophecy and sharp tongues. It was a wedding that did not just crown a queen, it redefined what it meant to be queen. But Catherine Howard's wedding, if it can even be called, that was barely more than a courtly murmur. A celebration smothered beneath the weight of secrets. No one dared speak aloud. One wedding was etched into England's political body like a scar. The other was little more than the drawing of a curtain before the final act of a tragedy already unfolding. And if Anne's wedding dressed her in majesty, Catherine's wrapped her in a trap, lined with silk and scented with doom. When Anne Boleyn wed Henry VIII in the year 1533, it was not merely a marriage, it was the culmination of a war fought in whispers and laws. A triumph over Catherine of Aragon that had taken nearly 7 years of struggle, annulments, proclamations, and parliamentary inventions. The ceremony was held in secret at first, under the early darkness of January, with only a handful of witnesses, but by June the coronation roared through London like thunder. Crowds lined the streets. Processions of gold and crimson wound through the city, carrying the new queen to Westminster Abbey, where Anne, already heavily pregnant, received the crown of St. Edward. It was the same crown used for kings, and the symbolism was deliberate. This was no consort. Anne was sovereign in her own right, and the child in her belly, presumed to be a prince, would be heir to a new dynasty, forged by defiance. Henry had broken with Rome for her. He had made himself supreme head of the church for her. He had exiled ambassadors, dismissed advisors, and excommunicated himself from centuries of tradition, all for her hand. The wedding was both a love letter and a declaration of war, and for a brief moment, Anne stood tall, untouchable, glowing, crowned by both ambition and divine favour. Catherine Howard's wedding, by contrast, arrived like a rumour. No one wanted to confirm. It was the year 1540, and the king was old, his ulcerated legs stinking through the corridors of Hampton Court, his paranoia clinging to every shadow. He had just divorced Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife, on the grounds of non-consummation. And suddenly this young girl, barely past 15, was being spoken of as the next queen. There was no papal rupture this time. No fire-breathing reformists. No thunderous processions or sacred oil. Only a quiet ceremony. A few chosen lords. A marriage conducted behind closed doors. Perhaps in part because of the whispers already. Beginning whispers of music, teachers, and love letters and memories Catherine had been instructed to bury. She was unready, untrained, and entirely unprotected. The king, nearly 30 years, her senior, called her his rose, without a thorn. But even roses have roots. And Catherine's past, though poorly remembered, had already been scribbled into court records by men who would one day use it to destroy her. Anne Boleyn's wedding made her untouchable, at least for a time. Catherine's wedding made her vulnerable from the moment she said yes. And the true difference between their fates came not only from the way they wed, but in the laws that followed. For Anne, the existing laws of England had to be twisted into knots to justify her downfall. She was accused not merely of adultery but of treason, a convenient legal fiction that allowed for beheading, even though her only true crime was failure. Failure to bear a son. Failure to be silent. Failure to bow when she should have smiled. But Catherine's crime had not even been defined yet when she committed it. It was only after her arrest that Parliament scrambled to pass a new law, one so peculiar, so specific. It seemed written with only one person in mind. It was called the Royal Assent by Commission Act, passed in the year 1541. And it made it high treason for any future queen to fail to disclose her sexual history to the king within the first 20 days of marriage. More than that, it gave the crown the power to execute her without a trial. The law was not retroactive, but Catherine was condemned under it anyway. The axe was waiting before the ink on the statute had dried. Anne Boleyn was allowed, if not encouraged, to stand trial. The charges were wild 5 lovers, including her own brother. A plot to kill the king. Acts of sorcery and seduction and betrayal, but she still appeared in court. She spoke. She listened. She locked eyes with her accusers. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. But the performance of justice was kept intact. Catherine Howard, on the other hand, was denied even that illusion. After being arrested at Hampton Court, she was imprisoned in a small, bare room, cut off from the world, and subjected to interrogations behind closed doors. She never stood before a jury. She never heard formal charges read aloud. She was sentenced by proclamation, executed by decree. The wedding had made her queen, the law made her disposable. And yet beneath the weight of law and politics, there is still something more human, more haunting, about the differences in how they carried themselves in marriage. Anne Boleyn was a woman who had clawed her way to the throne through intelligence, flirtation, calculation, and pride. She played the game, sometimes cruelly, and when she lost, she knew what it cost. Catherine Howard was a girl taught nothing but how to please, how to survive, how to smile when it hurt. She had been passed from guardian to guardian, neglected, isolated, and groomed long before Henry ever noticed her. Her wedding was not a victory. It was a sentence wrapped in pearls. And when her past caught up with her, when the names Culpeper and Derham were whispered into royal ears, she had nowhere to run. No friends at court, no title to protect her, no church willing to split itself in two to save her name. Only silence, cold chambers, and the tick of time moving toward the block. So the weddings of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were not just royal ceremonies. They were blueprints for execution. Anne was raised so high that her fall would echo for centuries. Catherine was never allowed to rise at all. And the law that trailed after her like a noose, ensured that when she fell, There would be no questions asked, no trial staged, no mourning cloth spread across the scaffold, only straw, and the sound of a teenage girl begging history not to forget her. The Tower of London does not change for queens. It waits. Its stones do not soften. Its staircases do not tilt more gently beneath royal feet. Whether a monarch arrives, crowned in triumph or chained in disgrace, the tower receives her the same way, with cold steps, wind-whipped courtyards, and thick doors that do not open again once closed. But if you listen closely, you can hear the difference in footsteps. In the year 1536, a queen named Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London for the second time, not as a triumphant bride riding toward coronation, but as a prisoner holding her breath. 3 years earlier, she had walked the Queen's stairs with music in the air, her belly round with the child that the world expected to be a prince, her future wrapped in silks and the murmur of prophecy. Now she stepped from a barge again, into the same fortress. But this time, the sky felt lower, the silence sharper, the crowd no longer cheered, and though the staircase was unchanged, her world had collapsed between the first step and the last. They say the journey from Greenwich to the tower took nearly 3 hours, the river winding like a funeral ribbon beneath a spring sky that did not yet know it would have to weep. Anne was still a queen in name, not yet convicted, and so she was permitted to arrive with dignity. The royal apartments where she had once prepared for her coronation were opened to her again, though now they felt like an echo chamber. Walls that remembered a crown, but whispered of ruin. She had no idea what the charges would be. She only knew that her enemies had moved faster than her allies, and that the man she had given everything to, the king she had once teased into defying the Pope, had gone silent. Anne had walked these stairs once in triumph. Now she stood among the same stones, feeling each breath like a betrayal. Catherine Howard did not get the Queen's stairs. She was not given royal apartments. When she arrived at the Tower in the year 1542, she entered through a different door, one soaked in dread and common shame. It was called Traitor's Gate, the water entrance that spat out condemned men and women like a cold, wet throat, choking down the lives of the forgotten. Catherine was no longer queen, not even in name. The moment she had been arrested, stripped of her titles, she became something else entirely. A girl the king had changed his mind about. She had no trial to await, no ceremony to fear, only death. And so when she was pushed onto the barge at Hampton Court and made her way down the Thames, the journey was not 3 hours, but an eternity. Because somewhere along the river, she passed under London Bridge, and there, she would have seen the heads of Thomas Culpeper, of Francis Derham, men accused of loving her, or simply being near her in the wrong way. Their faces, now blackened and unrecognizable, looked down upon the water that carried her body to the same fate. Catherine arrived, not as a queen, but as a cautionary tale. She was manhandled, not escorted. There were no silks, only wool, no canopy, only the grey sky and the eyes of guards who did not meet her gaze. No music, only the hollow slap of water against wood, the distant moan of wind through tower stones, and the breathless silence of a girl who had run out of time. Anne Boleyn, even in disgrace, was never manhandled. She was feared still dangerous in her fall. The lieutenant of the tower greeted her with trembling formality. When she asked whether she would be placed in a dungeon, the officer quickly assured her she would remain in the royal lodgings. And yet, even in those familiar rooms, she sensed the betrayal. Her ladies-in-waiting were not friends but spies, appointed to watch her every word, to record her mutterings and pass them to Cromwell. She laughed. She wept. She spoke in circles, her mind spiraling beneath the weight of confusion and dread. She had walked the Queen's stairs once to be crowned. Now she wandered the same halls, like a ghost rehearsing her death. Catherine, by contrast, was hidden away, stored like evidence, not housed like royalty. She was placed in a cell with no memory of majesty. There were no tapestries, no heraldic banners, just cold stone, dark corners, and the suffocating knowledge that no one was coming to plead for her. No one would bring her news. No sympathetic archbishop would speak her name. She was alone with her fears, her prayers, and the echoes of names: Manox, Dereham, Culpeper, each one, a thread in the noose tightening around her neck. Anne still held on to fragments of hope in those early days. Hope that Henry might change his mind, that Elizabeth might be spared, that her trial might reveal the truth. She composed herself. She practiced her dignity like armor. She was a Boleyn, clever, educated, and dangerous, even when cornered. But Catherine had no such training, no education, no political instincts. She had been taught only to be pleasing, to smile, to survive by beauty and sweetness. And now neither could save her. She paced her cell in silence. She asked for the block to be brought to her, so she could practice kneeling. She whispered rehearsals of her own execution to the darkness, mouthing the words she would say when the crowd gathered to watch her vanish. The tower does not forget who it has swallowed. Its stones remember the difference in arrival. Anne Boleyn arrived with status, even as it crumbled. Catherine Howard arrived with none. Anne came as a fallen queen. Catherine came as a discarded girl. Anne had her own bedchamber. Catherine slept under guard. Anne was allowed to write. Catherine was watched when she prayed. And yet, both of them heard the same sounds each night, the wind dragging itself across the ramparts, the footsteps of guards echoing through the corridors, and the slow groan of doors opening for no one. One had walked those stairs before, basking in glory. One entered by the same gate as thieves and rebels. But both knew the truth, that in the tower, queens are no safer than traitors. And when the scaffold is built, the stones do not care whose feet they last felt. There is a kind of silence that only visits the hours before execution. It is not the silence of sleep or prayer or peace, but something heavier, something that waits with the blade and sits beside the condemned like a ghost that cannot be dismissed. In the Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard awaited their final mornings, the silence grew louder with every passing hour, stretching like a shadow over the courtyard, the river, the scaffold itself, and somewhere beneath that stillness, two deaths were preparing themselves, one with a hidden sword, one with an unrelenting axe, both sharp, both final, both summoned by the same king. But where Anne's death unfolded with eerie calm and ghostly ceremony, Catherine's was soaked in fear, haste, and something more bitter, the unmistakable cruelty of forgetting that the girl kneeling at the block was barely more than a child. Anne Boleyn was told she would be executed by beheading, a mercy not given lightly, especially to women accused of treason. But Henry VIII, in one of his strange turns of image consciousness, I had ordered something rarer, still a French-style execution by sword. It was not out of affection, not out of regret, not even out of honor. It was, perhaps, because he wanted her death to be quick, clean, and above all else, stage-managed. The sword, unlike the axe, did not require multiple blows. It sang through the air once, almost invisibly, and the head was gone before the body knew it had ended. A master swordsman was summoned from Calais, paid and instructed, and told to bring not just skill but silence. And so, days before the blade ever moved, the sword was hidden beneath the straw of the scaffold, out of sight, like a guest waiting for the cue to enter. Anne's final day began, not with panic, but with stillness. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of sober dignity, She comforted her sobbing ladies in waiting with a steadiness that startled them. When the lieutenant of the tower came for her, she walked to the scaffold on steady legs, though the crowd watched with held breath, and the morning air hung heavy with dread. When she mounted the steps, she turned to the people not to curse, not to blame, but to speak words so graceful they have haunted centuries. She said she had come to die according to the law, that she would accuse no man, that she prayed for the king's long reign, that he had always been a good and gentle lord, and even if those words were spoken with trembling lips or rehearsed for mercy, they were received in stunned silence. She knelt where she was told, blindfolded, her lips moving in prayer. Jesus, receive my soul. She whispered, to God I commend my spirit. The swordsman, barefoot to muffle his approach, waited for the signal. Then, while Anne knelt with her face tilted to heaven, an assistant made a small noise, perhaps a cry, a distraction, and in that heartbeat of turned attention, the blade swept down like a shadow, and Anne Boleyn was gone. Her ladies screamed. One fainted. The crowd wept. The Queen's head lay in the straw. Her dark hair spread like a fan. Her face calm, almost startled. Her body, still dressed in royal layers, collapsed forward. No coffin had been prepared. A linen cloth was wrapped around her. An arrow chest, crude and narrow, was fetched. Her ladies lifted her themselves. No man was allowed to touch her. They carried her, bone by bone, soul by soul, to the chapel where the stone would one day carry her name. Catherine Howard had no sword waiting in the straw. There was no foreign executioner, no courtly mercy, only the blunt edge of English justice, the axe, heavy and final, often wielded by hands more used to timber than queens. On the night before her death, Catherine was told to dispose of her soul. She was to die at 9 o'clock. The words fell like ice onto her skin, and in those hours that followed, she did something Anne had not needed to do. She asked for the execution block to be brought to her chamber. She wanted to practice. She wanted to kneel, to know how to hold herself, how to place her neck, how not to tremble when the cold wood kissed her throat. It is a detail too painful to imagine fully a girl rehearsing her death, as if it were a dance she must perform without misstep. When morning came on February the 13th of the year 1542, the sky was grey, and the wind from the river sharp. Catherine dressed in black. She had grown pale in the tower, thin, her eyes no longer wide with flirtation, but drawn with fear. She was helped up the steps of the scaffold, unable to walk alone. She was too weak, her legs too unsteady. Her voice, so often described as sweet and girlish, was barely audible as she faced the crowd. She said she had merited 100 deaths for offending the king. She asked Christians to pray for her, to learn from her youth, from her sins, from the ruin she had brought upon herself and those she had loved. Some say she whispered that she would rather die the wife of Culpeper than the Queen of England, though no record can prove it. But if she said it, it would have been a truth spoken too late, a final wish for a life unlived. The executioner handed her the blindfold. She tied it herself. She knelt as she had practiced, and then the axe rose once, twice, and came down with a sickening finality. Catherine's head rolled forward. The executioner lifted it by the hair and showed the crowd her eyes closed, her mouth silent. God save the king, he said. There were no screams, no courtly ladies to cradle her corpse. She was wrapped in a black cloak, then carried without fanfare to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But this time, no one marked the grave properly, and worse still, quicklime was poured over her, not for cleanliness, not for decay, but for erasure. Her body was meant to disappear, to rot faster, to vanish without remembrance, The exact place of her burial remains uncertain. Her marker today is more guess than fact. Even in death, she was denied the dignity Anne had been allowed. And yet, what lingers most is not the difference in weapons or ceremony. It is the silence. Anna Boleyn died speaking. Catherine Howard died, practiced into silence. Anne's blade was hidden. Catherine's axe stood waiting in full view. Anne's end was dignified even in horror. Catherine's was small, shamed, smothered, but both were final, and both were called justice. When death falls, it does not ask where the body shall lie. It does not fold the hands, close the eyes, or whisper an apology into the ear that can no longer hear. That is left to the living. That is left to the women who kneel beside the scaffold, still shaking, still sobbing. I'm still trying to gather the pieces of someone who had once been queen. But even in death, not all women are treated the same, and the difference between how Anne Boleyn's body was handled and how Catherine Howard's was discarded is not just a question of coffin or cloth, but of memory and meaning of who was mourned and who was erased. The sword had fallen. Anne was gone. Her head lay in the straw, her face still, her lips parted, as though she had not finished her last prayer. Her ladies, who had stood behind her in trembling loyalty, rushed forward as the crowd remained frozen in grief or awe or shock. They did not scream. They did not faint. They acted, with hands that had once braided her hair, laced her gowns, and wiped away her tears. They now wrapped her head in linen. Gently, as if she were only sleeping, they lifted her body next, gathering the limbs, pressing the blood back into fabric, and pulling the final cloth across what had once been majesty. They refused to let the Tower men touch her. No rough hands, no soldier's grip, only women who had loved her, served her, seen her laugh and rage, and whisper lullabies to a child she would never see grow up. No coffin had been prepared, no tomb awaited, but a carpenter's arrow chest, narrow and plain, was found within the Tower walls. It had been used to hold arrows and bolts, and now it would hold the remains of a woman who had once held the fate of England in her smile. They laid her inside it, curling her where she could not stretch, tucking in the linen, smoothing the fabric. It was not fitting. It was not royal, but it was the best they could give her, and it was more than most received. They carried her across the green, the stones of the Tower echoing beneath their shoes, toward the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, whose name means St. Peter in chains. There, in that ancient place where the condemned are buried within steps of their place of execution, they lowered the box into a shallow grave near the altar. She was placed without trumpet, without mourning bell, without ceremony, but she was placed with love, and in time, her name would return. Her stone would be carved. Her grave would be found. Years later, her daughter Elizabeth, the child she left behind, would reign longer than any monarch before her. And though she never spoke often of her mother, there were moments when silence spoke louder than words. Anne Boleyn's memory, bruised but unbroken, bloomed again. Roses were left on her grave every year. Visitors knelt, historians argued, but the queen who had been accused of witchcraft and incest was not forgotten. The chest that had once held her broken body became a symbol, a relic, a resting place for a woman whose death had shaken the world. Catherine Howard, on the other hand, was wrapped not in linen, but in a black cloak. There was no royal fabric to soften her limbs, no chest to carry her from scaffold to chapel. When the axe had done its work, the crowd gasped, the air stilled, and the body of the fifth Queen of Henry VIII lay folded on the straw. Her ladies, fewer and less prepared, moved in with hesitant hands. The cloak was pulled tight, the head covered quickly, the blood soaking through. She had been light in life. In death, She was lighter still. A small frame born of neglect and hurried into horror. They carried her not with ceremony, but with urgency. The tower did not pause to honor her. There was no procession, no final words spoken over the place where she would lie. The hole had already been dug, a shallow grave in the chapel, near others who had met the same end. But something darker was waiting. As Catherine's wrapped body was lowered into the ground, a command was given, one that would mark her burial forever. Quicklime. It was to be poured over her. This substance, harsh and caustic, was meant to destroy. It burned. It erased. It accelerated decay. Perhaps it was thought to be sanitary. Perhaps it was an act of shame. But whatever the reason, it sent a clear message. This was a woman whose body must not remain. Not just dead. Gone. She was the only queen buried in that chapel to receive such treatment. No one else? Not even traitors whose names have long turned to dust, was given that same final insult. It was as if someone, somewhere, could not bear the idea that Catherine might lie peacefully, that her name might be remembered, that her bones might be found. Even her gravestone, now marked with her name, is based on guesswork. The precise location of her remains is unknown. The cloak rotted. The lime did its work, and the girl who had once danced in silks through the halls of Hampton Court was turned to silence. Bone. And mist. There is a cruelty in forgetting, a violence in neglect. Anne's resting place, though hurried and humble, was held in memory. Catherine's was dissolved. Anne was granted a box. Catherine was given a hole. Anne's name was whispered in reverence. Catherine's became a cautionary tale. Even in death, one was protected, the other punished. And yet, the stones remember. The chapel stands. The tower walls do not lie. They have seen queens rise and fall. They have watched velvet turn to blood. And somewhere beneath those stones, beneath the lime and the silence, the truth of Catherine Howard remains not just in bones, but in the injustice of her end, in the quiet of night, when the air cools and the Thames slips past the tower's edge. Some say you can still feel the sorrow. The difference between the queen who was gently placed in a chest by loving hands and the girl whose shame was buried beneath caustic powder. Two bodies, two graves, two messages written into the dirt of England's history, one remembered, one made to disappear. Time is merciless in its forgetting, but it is also strangely faithful. It clings to some names like ivy, clings to stone, wrapping them tighter with each passing year, letting them bloom even in shadow, and it lets other names slip quietly, without protest beneath the surface of the world, where they are softened by forgetfulness and buried beneath stories someone else got to write. Anne Boleyn left behind a name that England could not forget, no matter how many tried to silence it. Catherine Howard left behind only a question. And the difference, in the end, was not just in their deaths, but in their daughters, or, rather, in the one daughter who lived long enough to change everything. When Anne Boleyn knelt at the scaffold in the year 1536, she whispered not only her final prayers, but the last breath of hope she had for her child. Elizabeth, a daughter born less than 3 years earlier, small and red-haired and bright-eyed, but not a son, not the heir Henry had demanded. Anne had failed in the one thing that would have saved her, and yet, even in her final words, she praised the king. She asked the crowd to judge her kindly. She forgave, with the voice of a woman who understood that mercy, even if unreturned, must still be given. But what she could not say, what she could not be certain of, was whether Elizabeth would live, whether the girl she had carried, birthed, loved, and whispered dreams to in the hush of royal chambers, would be remembered or erased like her mother. But Elizabeth did live. She did more than live. She watched She waited. She learned. And when her turn came, she reigned for 45 years, the longest and most transformative reign England had known. A queen who took her mother's silence and turned it into sovereignty. A queen who ruled alone, who signed with a lion's hand. And who, though she wore pearls and velvet, held within her a steel that echoed with the memory of Anne's last breath. It is tempting to say that Anne Boleyn's legacy is Elizabeth, that the daughter vindicated the mother, that the crown returned, however delayed, and it is true that Anne's bloodline reshaped the monarchy, that her name was polished and redeemed in the court of her daughter. But legacies are not clean things. They are messy, twisting, made of rumours and retellings. Two of portraits painted decades after the eyes have closed. Anne's name was restored, but only after generations of whisper and ink had turned her from a woman into a myth. Catherine Howard left no daughter, no son, no child to remember her hands. Her voice, the way she had once laughed before the Tower stole her voice, and so her legacy was not shaped by blood, but by those who chose to speak about her or not. Historians wrote her as silly, as promiscuous, as foolish. Some described her as empty-headed, others as a pawn. Rare were those who paused and said, quietly, carefully, but she was young, she was groomed, she was betrayed. Catherine's story was not one she got to shape. It was written by men who had survived her, judges who had never seen her cry, writers who imagined her sins more vividly than her fears. She had been used, even as a girl, by men older than her, trusted as teachers or guardians. Henry Manox, Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper. Each name left a mark, and when she was queen only a year, barely more than a season, those marks were turned into nooses. And when the axe fell, there was no child to watch, no daughter to grow, no figure in the future to say, "She was my mother." Only silence, only the strange, uncomfortable way the world seems to forget those who leave no lineage. But Catherine's lack of a child does not mean she left nothing behind. She left something quieter, something harder to trace. She left a lesson, a haunting, a stillness in the Tower that does not lift to even century later. Those who visit the chapel where she was buried, in that quicklime-soaked grave, often say they feel something cold, not cold like weather, but like memory, a kind of ache in the stones, the ghost of a girl who had nothing, who died with her name slipping from everyone's mouth. Anne Boleyn is visited every year on the anniversary of her death. White roses are laid on her grave. Tourists weep. Writers write. The stones are warm with feet. She is remembered through Elizabeth, through her story, through the myths wrapped in her name. But Catherine is guessed. Her gravestone was added centuries after she died. The exact spot, no one knows. The lime ensured that even the plaque is just a guess. There are no annual flowers, no poems, only silence, and the wind that slips through the Tower each February. And still, the comparison is unfair, because Anne was many things sharp, educated, ambitious, but she was also given chances Catherine never had. She had time, she had letters, she had a trial. Catherine had none. She was raised in shadows, left to the mercy of men who never saw her as more than a toy. She was not taught to speak, only to smile, not taught to rule, only to obey. And when the time came, she was not offered even the dignity of being remembered. But perhaps the memory is shifting. Perhaps in telling their stories together, we begin to see the injustice not just in their deaths, but in their aftermaths. That Anne Boleyn, though mourned, was also used. That Elizabeth, though magnificent, bore a crown stained by her mother's blood. And that Catherine Howard, though forgotten, stands as a warning not of what she did, but of what was done to her. One queen left a daughter who would become legend. One girl left a silence that speaks louder than any crown. Every May, white roses are placed on a stone in the chapel of St. Peter, ad Vincula, the ancient house of prayer nestled within the Tower of London, where the breath of lost queens still clings to the stones. The roses arrive without ceremony. They are not scattered, but laid carefully, each one a tribute, a whisper, a vow that time cannot silence. The stone reads Anne Boleyn, and beneath that name, etched in solemn lettering, is the date of her death, May the 19th, the year 1536. Those flowers, sometimes fresh from gardens, sometimes wrapped in paper, kissed with poems or prayers, are more than decoration. They are defiance. They say she is remembered, she is mourned, she is not forgotten. Anne Boleyn's grave lies not in a grand tomb, not beneath a soaring monument, but flush with the stone floor of the chapel, marked among others who were executed and buried in haste, in fear, in disgrace. But over time, her name was lifted back into the light. Scholars studied here. Poets honoured her. Her daughter's reign rethreaded her name into royal memory. And so, while Anne was beheaded as a traitor, buried in an arrow chest, and denied all ceremony at the time of her death, her resting place has become sacred in its own quiet way. Visitors pause over it. They cry. They kneel. Some speak to her. Some bring small gifts, books, letters, pendant. And each year, when the roses are laid down, it is as though she stands again, not as the queen who fell, but as the woman who endured. But only a few feet away, in the same chapel, lies another queen whose name was not so kindly restored. Her marker is newer, her memory, fainte, and the stone that bears her name, Catherine Howard, may not mark her true resting place at all. For Catherine's burial, if it can be called that, was never meant to be found. After her execution on a February morning in the year 1542, her body was not laid gently into the earth. It was not wrapped in linen or placed in a box. Instead, it was draped in a dark cloak, lowered into a hole, and then buried beneath a harsh flood of quicklime. The lime, more corrosive than time, devoured everything it touched. Flesh, cloth, memory. Historians have puzzled for centuries over this detail. The lime, the haste, the lack of ceremony. Was it for sanitation, a precaution against disease, or was it something darker? A deliberate attempt to erase, to make her rot faster, to ensure there would be nothing left to honour, no bones to collect, no relics to discover, no grave for mourners to find. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. Catherine's body vanished into the earth not as a queen, not even as a woman, but as something inconvenient, something to be erased. And so her name became a whisper, her story, an afterthought, her grave, a guess. There is a section of the chapel floor that shows signs of lime damage, pale streaks across the stone, scars left by the substance meant to erase her. Some believe this is where she lies, but no one can say for certain. And the plaque placed in her name rests not above a confirmed grave, but above uncertainty. It is a gesture kind, perhaps, but late, very late. No one leaves roses on Catherine's stone, or if they do so rarely, quietly, almost apologetically, as though unsure whether they are permitted to remember her. She left no child, no legacy, no great rebellion. She was not the mother of a queen. She changed no church, altered no nation. And yet the injustice of her memory is sharp, because if Anne's death was political, Catherine's was personal. Anne died with her title still echoing in the crowd's ears. Catherine died as a girl whose name had already begun to vanish, before the axe even fell. But there is something sacred in remembering the forgotten, in turning toward the grave that bears no offerings and saying this, too, was a life. This, too, was a queen. However briefly, however poorly she was protected, however quickly she was discarded. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is a holy place. Beneath its flagstone floor lie not just Anne and Catherine, but many others, nobles, rebels, saints, and scapegoats. It is a place of silence and shadow, and yet it holds both the remembered and the erased. It equalizes the powerful and the punished. It carries the footsteps of tourists, priests, guards, and ghosts. And beneath all those steps, two queens lay, one marked by roses, one marked by lime. Some say the chapel sings in the quiet that if you press your palm to the stones, you will feel a heartbeat, a rhythm of sorrow echoing upward from below. Some claim to see the flicker of a girl in white at night, drifting between the pews, her head bent, her hands clasped, as though still waiting for forgiveness that never came. Some say it is Anne. Others swear it is Catherine. But maybe it is both. Maybe it is neither. Maybe the stones themselves are remembering what history tried to forget. And perhaps there is a comfort in knowing that both women so different, so unequally mourned, now lie within feet of each other, beneath the same roof, beneath the same prayers, one grieved by generations, one only now being truly seen. The chapel does not choose who gets flowers. The tower does not whisper which name should be spoken. That choice is ours. And so, if you ever find yourself walking across that floor, if you stop before those stones, if you feel the hush settle into your bones, remember this one. Queen was given a sword. The other, an axe. One was buried with linen. The other, with lime. But both were girls who trusted love and lost everything to it. Both looked into the eyes of their executioners and saw not justice, but indifference. Both knew that no crown, no smile, no kiss from a king could ever protect them once they had fallen from favor. Both deserve flowers. There is a stillness that follows death, especially the kind ordered by kings. It does not arrive immediately, not when the axe falls, or when the head tumbles into the straw, not when the crowd gasps or when the tower chapel swallows the coffin. It comes later quietly, like a tide that washes over a moment and smooths its edges into silence. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard stood still in death. They did not breathe. They did not plead. They did not rise. But the world around them kept moving. The court went on. The king remarried. The lords bowed. The scribes wrote. The banquets returned. The men who had watched them fall, some with satisfaction, some with sorrow, dusted off their sleeves and stepped back into power. The silence that followed the Queen's deaths was not a silence of mourning. It was a silence of survival. When Anne Boleyn died in the year 1536, Henry VIII wore black. But only briefly. He did not retreat in grief, nor retira into solitude. Within days, perhaps hours, he rode out into the sunshine, hunting, laughing, already speaking of Jane Seymour. Just 11 days after Anne's beheading, he married her. The crown had hardly cooled. Anne's blood had barely dried on the scaffold planks, and already her successor was dressed, crowned, and placed in the Queen's chamber. There were no years of quiet remembrance. There was no period of royal mourning. There was only motion forward, relentless, unapologetic. The king needed a son, and Anne had failed. The story was over. The king had turned the page, and yet, even in turning it, he could not escape her shadow. Anne Boleyn had changed more than her marital status. She had torn England from Rome. She had birthed a daughter who would one day rule in her own name, And she had spoken too sharply, thought too deeply, stood too tall for a court that preferred its women silent and smiling. Her enemies, men like Thomas Cromwell, had outmaneuvered her, but they, too, would fall. Cromwell himself would be arrested just 4 years later, accused of treason, executed in turn. The machinery that had destroyed Anne did not stop. It simply found new victims. Catherine Howard's death, in the year 1542, drew even less pose. There was no poetry in it, no legacy waiting to bloom. She was not buried as a mother or a reformer. She had not changed the course of religion or secured a line of succession. She had danced, smiled, perhaps loved unwisely. She had barely reigned at all. When she died, Henry was already weary, heavier, slower, and more withdrawn. His leg festered, his temper frayed. He spoke less of love, more of loyalty. Within weeks of Catherine's execution, he turned his attention to his final wife, Catherine Parr, a woman chosen not for beauty or passion, but for patience, obedience, and the rare quality of surviving. And the men they endured, those who had orchestrated Catherine's downfall, those who had whispered of her past, collected the letters, arranged the interrogations, remained at court. Bishop Cranmer, Thomas Wriothesley, the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, even those who had once loved her, or claimed to, vanished into silence. Seeking comfort in forgetting, no one stood beside her at the scaffold. No one carried her memory into the next reign. She was a shadow on the palace wall, wiped away when the candles were snuffed. But if the men moved on, the queens remained still. In stone, in stories, in the silence between footsteps echoing through the tower's halls, Anne's voice survives in letters, in trial records, in the careful rhetoric of her last speech. Catherine's voice is barely heard, muffled by the words of others, twisted by those who spoke over her. But both linger, in different ways. Anne stands in portrait sharpied, determined, her bee pendant glinting just above the lace collar. Catherine barely appears at all. One left an image, the other a ghost. And yet, the men are remembered as well, but differently. They are remembered as actors in a larger play, as strategists, politicians, survivors. Their legacies are debated in books, taught in schools, forgiven. Henry VIII, the husband who ordered both executions, is not remembered only as a killer of wives. He is remembered as a founder of the Church of England, a strong monarch, a flawed but fascinating king. His cruelty is placed beside his charisma, his violence excused as the cost of kingship. His marriages are counted like trophies, his queens, too often, like notches on a belt. But Anne and Catherine remind us that stillness can be louder than motion, that to be buried is not to be gone. That silence can accuse more powerfully than speech. In every stone of the tower, there are echoes not just of what happened, but of what should not have. Anne died with her dignity intact, her voice her own. Catherine died rehearsing her final moment, practicing how to kneel, and the men who stood near them did not weep. They nodded, they recorded, they wrote the king's will into law. It is easy to believe history belongs to those who survived it. The men who moved on, the kings who remarried, the lords who rewrote the records. But sometimes, history changes its mind. Sometimes it listens again. It hears the footsteps of women walking to the scaffold. It hears the echo of prayers, the rustle of a linen blindfold, the breath before the blade, and it begins to remember differently. Not just the names, but the stillness. Not just the kings, but the queens who were told they mattered only until they disappointed. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard do not move anymore, but their stillness speaks. There is a moment just before sleep, when the mind floats between memory and dream, between what was and what might have been. And in that quiet space, if one listens closely, one might still hear them, two voices, distinct but fading, carried on the breath of history like a lullaby wrapped in iron. One belonged to a woman who would not kneel until the blade was drawn, and the other to a girl who knelt before. She understood why she must. One refused to bow, the other never had a chance to rise. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, names long carved into the tower's deepest silence, were not only queens who died, they were women, swallowed by a world that demanded obedience from their smiles and blood from their missteps. And as the world moved on, it left behind two graves, two stories, and one haunting question. What remains when the crown slips from the head and the sword has done its work? Anne Boleyn was not born to be queen. She made herself one, or perhaps more truthfully, she allowed the storm to carry her. She spoke too boldly, thought too cleverly, and believed too strongly in the power of her mind to stay silent. The court expected her to charm, to serve, to obey, but she interrupted. She questioned, she led, and in doing so, she changed everything. England broke from Rome because of her. A church was built on the bones of her ambition. And yet, in the end, the same court that once bowed before her eyes bowed again as the sword took her head. She was remembered because her daughter reigned, but long before Elizabeth wore the crown, Anne had already refused to disappear. In her trial, in her words, in the quiet dignity with which she forgave the king who destroyed her, she left behind not only a legacy but a challenge. To stand, to speak, to endure. Catherine Howard never had that chance. She was too young, too unguarded, too thoroughly unprotected by a world that offered her everything but safety. She did not climb toward power with letters and reforms and religious vision. She was pulled toward it like a flower placed on a stage she did not choose. Her smiles were read as consent, her silence as guilt. She was not crowned with prophecy or hope, only with expectation. Be beautiful, be cheerful, be silent. And when her past was uncovered, when the men who had shaped and used her returned in stories told by others, she was judged not by what she had done as queen, but by what had been done to her as a girl. Her death was not majestic. It was not political. It was personal, brutal, rushed, and nearly forgotten. And yet, even in their differences, Anne and Catherine remain bound, not just by marriage to the same king, not just by the stone chapel that holds what is left of them, but by the stillness of their end. They are no longer women who speak. They are women who were spoken over, but we can still choose to hear them. Anne's last words were not for herself. They were for the king, for his mercy, for his legacy. Perhaps she hoped, even then, to protect her daughter by protecting his name. Catherine's last act was to practice dying, to try to get it right, to be still enough, silent enough, obedient enough not to make a mess of it. She had already been erased in life. In death, she tried to become invisible. One was ready, too ready. The other, never ready at all. It is easy to say that things have changed, that queens no longer lose their heads, that women are no longer tried in whispers or buried in shame. But the truth is more difficult. Anne and Catherine do not only belong to the 16th century. Their stories repeat in smaller ways in boardrooms, in bedrooms, in classrooms, in courtrooms. Women still speak too sharply and are punished. Girls are still asked to smile and then blamed when they do. Memory still favors the powerful, and silence is still a tool sharpened by those who never expect to bleed from it. So what do we do? In this quiet moment before sleep, with the memory of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, we remember not just their deaths, but their lives. We remember the girl who wasn't ready, not because she was weak, but because no one ever gave her the chance to become strong. And we remember the queen who refused to bow, Not because she thought she would win, but because she believed her dignity was not the king's to take. They are still here. In the folds of history, in the soft breath of stories told under low lamps, in the hands that place flowers on a stone and say, I remember you. One left a daughter, one left a question, and both left behind the truth that even when forgotten, irased, or misunderstood, a woman's story is never truly gone. It waits, beneath the stone, beneath the lime, beneath the silence, and when we listen, really listen, they rise again.